Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to everyone joining in our Zoom call and via the YouTube live stream to this online session in our mini-series dealing with China on high-tech issues. My name is Brigitte Dekker, Research Fellow at the Clingendael Institute, and I will moderate today's session. By now, everyone will probably know that the Clingendael Institute published a report in December 2020 on dealing with China in the high-tech domain, with views including from our speakers today. I co-edited this report with my colleague Maaike Okano-Heijmans, who moderated the last two webinars in this series. As said, this webinar is part of a mini-series, and this is the third webinar in our series. In the second session, we focused on strategic autonomy and technical sovereignty, and this webinar, as well as the first webinar, are still available on the Clingendael YouTube channel. So in case you missed it, you can find it there. In our webinar, we are discussing parts of the EU's reorientation in trade, high-tech and the digital domain with our partners in the US and other like-minded countries. Joining us to talk about the future of cooperation in the tech domain are three excellent speakers today from Germany, the US and India. I will introduce you shortly and in a second, but for now, I would already like to thank you for being here today to discuss this really important topic with us. For the session today, the modes of cooperation between the EU and like-minded partners are central. With Joe Biden being now president of the US for most of 2 months, we can discuss how he may revive and renew the transatlantic relationship and build on the political values to guide a common approach in the digital domain. How has it changed from the moment we published our report? Several initiatives are now passing the review, and we are already discussed in our report. In particular, the Dekker Alliance, an initiative by CNAS in cooperation with the Asia Pacific Initiative and the German-based MERICS, and Biden's Summit of Democracies, to, in his words, renew the spirit and shared purpose of the nations of the free world. Those initiatives could hold great promises, but can also be considered as actions against Chinese rise in the digital domain. With the tensions between the US and China rising again last week in Alaska, and the EU-Chinese tensions this week with the travel bans China implemented as a response to the bans on the EU side, a constructive transatlantic relationship and a transatlantic dialogue, perhaps in the form of a relaunch of the US-EU-China dialogue, could be welcomed. In order to discuss these questions and more, we are joined today by Anika, Laudien, project manager at the Bertelsmann Stiftung, who co-wrote the German chapter in the report together with Bernard Bartsch. Secondly, we are joined by Martijn Rasser, senior research fellow at CNAS. And the panel closes with Rudra Chaudhuri, director of Carnegie India, to not only provide us with a transatlantic view, but also insights from one of the fastest growing digital economies in the world. Before turning to the panel, I would like to give the floor to Yvette van Eeghout. Having a remarkable track record and experience both at the Ministry of Economic Affairs, as Director European and International Affairs, and now in your current position as Director of Western Hemisphere at the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I do not believe there is someone better to open this panel and talk us through the latest geopolitical affairs at the nexus of economy, foreign policy, and high tech. Yvette, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's for me an honor to be in this session, the third session already. You've had my colleagues also from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs opening the other two. I'm really looking forward to hearing the experts actually. So I'm just we'll give a short introduction and then we'll move on to the experts and the debate. I think it's important also for people who are listening in maybe for the first time in this series to take a little bit of a step back and look at the role of technology in the world. And I think it's really always very important to realize that technology and high tech has tremendous potential to solve all kinds of global challenges like climate, health crisis, mobility. So we always need to keep that perspective in mind, that we're not, in some kind of a technological potential conflict or tension, but we really need to make technology work for good, to work really to solve the problems that we're all facing together. And that's also why we need to make sure that technology is available for everyone to address these issues. That's just one of my let's say hang-ups, that it's too much about alliances, about China versus US, but it's really about the potential of technology. This particular session is, of course, very much on alliances. So let me start that for the Netherlands, a rules-based international order is the most important thing. We're a very open and thus vulnerable trading nation. We're always very comfortable with, let's say, the frameworks for multilateral cooperation. We're a co-founder, of course, of the European Union, and that's our home. So for us, it's really important to make sure that whatever we do, we have a multilateral framework which is as inclusive as possible, with the right also enforcement of the rules, but always leading to the goals that I just stated. I think we have, as a country, quite a developed high-tech ecosystem, which also makes it extremely important in terms of competition, but also in terms of value chains, that we do have this framework, and we do have the proper enforcement mechanisms to make sure there's a level playing field and there's fair play in all of this domain. The EU, of course, like I said, is our home. Technology is very much a single market issue as well. So a lot of the measures that can be taken or can be thought up in the Netherlands always have a European dimension. So that's always our starting point. But at the same time, I think if we look at this extremely interconnected global issue, we need partners to work with also in the multilateral field. For us, the most important thing is that we have the multilateral system, which was designed for certain purposes. We might need to look at, maybe adapting some of the frameworks, but let's work with the multilateral organizations like the ITU, like the WIPO, like the WTO, and look at those. Where do we work together on these frameworks and make sure that it works for all of us? And of course, these sessions are very much focused on China and the US. The sheer size of China and its ambitions makes us, of course, compels us to be on guard. So I think that's clear, but we don't want to make it into a binary discussion or a polarized discussion. Again, coming back from what do we want technology and what do we need technology to do? So on the one hand, solving those challenges, on the other hand, also, I think safeguarding or protecting our way of life, as we've called it in the European Union, which are values and interests that are underpinned by all of the member states and like-minded countries. So, from the single market as our home market, the US, of course, very much interlinked economically with the European Union. So it's one of our preferred partners, of course, to tackle all kinds of issues with. And I think we need to, and we will be in close contact with the Biden administration to tackle all kinds of issues that pertain to this domain. I think also from the European Union side, we need to look at a more integrated approach. We cannot have trade policy, security policy, foreign policy, tech policy operate from silos. We really need to have an integrated approach there. And that's also how we would say the idea of a Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council would need to function, away from silos, but an integrated approach from all instruments and means we have to make sure that is streamlined. And then, on tech alliances, I'm really interested to hear, of course, what our experts have to say. I think we share a lot of common values and common approaches. So let's have that debate. It's still early days for the Dutch. We're thinking, on international technology cooperation. Again, first multilateralism, first from the EU side, but alliances, of course, working together within a multilateral framework are extremely useful. So I think that is more or less for me my first remarks, and it's a very broad issue, but we need to be almost surgical in approaching technology, because it's not, technologies are extremely specific, and the circumstances, the ecosystems are extremely let's say delicate. So I think that is also a call from our side to look at the issue from a very nuanced perspective, preferably a depoliticized, non-instrumentalized perspective, but really look at it for what it's about at the granular level, and make sure that any measures that are taken to safeguard technology, to do the right thing, are proportional and leading to the right outcome. So with that, I'd like to turn back to you, Brigitte, and I'd like to hear from the panelists their take on this. And thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you, Yvette, for taking a step back and also giving us a overview of not only the Dutch perspective, but also the Netherlands as a member state in the European Union as a perspective. I hope it will already provide the audience with some inspiration for questions. And talking about questions, if you have any and you are in the Zoom call, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many as possible. Unfortunately, on the YouTube live stream, you cannot pose any questions, so we are really counting on the Zoom participants to be as active as possible. And yeah, so that's for the questions. And then without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Anika, having a background in both European studies as well as Chinese and economics. You are right at the center of geopolitical affairs at the moment. So how do you and your government view the multilateral comeback of the US under the Biden administration?
Thank you, Brigitte. The multilateral comeback of the US under Biden is exactly what Europeans hoped for. And as Yvette already said, Europe is much, much more dependent on a functioning global multilateral system than the two superpowers, China and the US. And during the Americans' retreat from multilateralism under the Trump administration, Germany, together with France, launched the Alliance for Multilateralism as an informal network of states in 2019, seeking to stabilize a rule-based international order. And within this framework, Germany and others tried to find like-minded partners and allies beyond the US. And to see democratic small and middle powers rallying together during the Trump years was in many ways very important. And the comeback now of the US on the multilateral stage presents an opportunity to strengthen cooperation of like-minded states with the US in a key role. However, there is a loss of confidence and trust due to the experiences of the last few years in Europe. If there is to be a solid foundation, this trust must be rebuilt. So despite all the euphoria, we should remain realistic, not only because of the Trump experience, but also because of changing realities compared to the, for example, early 2000s. The new world order seems to be based on three power blocks, China, the US, and the EU. And against this backdrop, the question arises as to what multilateralism can look like that is fit for purpose. And in this context, a realistic goal for Europe, the US, and other allies could be to establish rules-based international institutions with different membership for different issues. Thank you. You are still on mute?
Let's unmute myself, yes. So really an ad hoc coalition mechanism, if I hear you talk. Are you considering the cooperation efforts now going on in the transatlantic context in the field of high tech? Do you think then your government and also you as an expert tending to be more towards such a framework as the Democratic Tech Alliance? Or would some sort of mechanism be desirable? What would be the key allies of the European Union in this?
I think the formula that should be applied here is whatever flies or form follows function. So it's definitely the right time to think about something like that. And the existing institutions, like, for example, the WTO, will not be able to solve the problems that we are facing as they are. And which format and which institutions are the right ones, whether it's, for example, within the framework of the OECD, or if it's the idea of Biden's Summit for Democracy, or Anja Emanuel's idea of a so-called Tech 10. This does not really seem to matter. What matters is that it's time to think about alternative coalition and to start testing them. And new alliances have to be created. And then we have to find out which of them work best. And chances are that we will end up with the kind of variable geometry. And the goal must be to experiment with it as much as possible in the next 2 to 3 years. And this should happen during the Biden administration, since a lot does depend on American leadership. And important is that we create the structures for us, of course, always against the backdrop of what is happening in China and what China does. But in the end, such collaborations have to work for us. And from the German point of view, it's important that Germany gets involved quickly, and a lot is dependent on the US, and we in Europe have to take into account and also understand the time pressure that the US is facing. And Yvette already mentioned that the EU is initiating the EU-US Tech and Technology Council, which could be an option, but we should definitely also think about including others like Japan, Australia, India, South Korea.
Thank you. And maybe to close real quick, what are your expectations for the years ahead, like 5 to 10 years? Do you see the EU and the US in a really revived transatlantic relationship, or do you see us still cooperating with China on matters like climate policies?
I think in general, it's a matter of setting the pace, and at the same time, we have to take China's ambitions very seriously. To briefly give an example, one of our study looks at the impact of China's strategy Made in China 2025 on Germany's mechanical engineering industry, and a clear picture emerges. Even if the business is still running well at the moment, if China succeeds, the German export will decline sharply. And the second development is that China will become a massive competitor on third markets as well. And we cannot really set the rules of the game in the China business, but we can try to do that on third markets. And our approach should be to take China ambitions seriously and assume that China itself does everything to get independent. And we have to plan with that, and we should not waste any time. And the longer we wait, the greater the risk that we will have lock-in effects in certain technologies, which means that Chinese technologies are so established that decoupling becomes even more difficult. And this also plays a major role for the Transatlantic Partnership. There is the hope that we will find our way back to a reliable partnership in which a joint transatlantic commitment to certain standards and is there, and that a level playing field among us is not in question. And therefore, we should focus on two things: repair and prepare. And the US and the EU should get their own houses in order by addressing some of our most critical differences on the economic agenda, like, for example, digital taxation, data privacy issues, etc. And one important step into the right direction was the lifting of tariffs in the Airbus-Boeing dispute. And then quickly, the relationship has to be crisis-proofed, and the time horizon should be here the next 3 to 4 years as well.
Perfect. Secondly, I would now like to pass on to Martijn. Martijn, you're working at CNAS. You have been closely involved in the establishment of the Democratic Tech Alliance. So I'm really happy that you're here to give us some context from a US perspective, of course. Maybe to ask you the same question, how do you consider the multilateral comeback of the US? And already related to that, how does the Tech Alliance fit into this? Yeah, over to you.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Brigitte. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation. Yeah, so this whole return to multilateralism, it's a very important and meaningful development. Multilateral partnerships are clearly an important pillar of the Biden administration's overall geopolitical and geoeconomic strategy. And yeah, in a lot of ways, this is a return to normalcy, right? I mean, this is the role that the United States has played in the world since the 1940s, and I think ultimately, when we look back on the past few years, the past 4 years, the Trump era, it was an aberration, and I think we're now back on a path of a proper role for the United States, as the world's largest economy, that does confer certain leadership responsibilities. But I think in particular, the renewed emphasis on working with like-minded countries, allies and partners, that's an essential component of how the United States will conduct itself on the global stage. And I think there's, in particular, given the challenge of a rising China, that that's really the only sensible way forward, is to cooperate and collaborate with other democracies in order to navigate the challenges ahead.
In the previous webinar, we were talking about whether the US, but also the European Union, should aim to run faster than China rather than tripping the other guy, as I was referred to China back then. Do you see whether the tech alliance or the US technological policies that are now in the making regarding innovation, but also finance for innovation and commercialization of innovation, will that be enough for the US to be able to compete with China, or what do you expect on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is, part of the reason why there's so much interest in a variety of tech alliances in the United States. Obviously, the United States can do quite a bit on its own, but ultimately, to be successful in this broader competition, the multilateral component is going to be key. And so what I see developing now is a strategy to have a wide array of relationships, right? And so bilateral efforts, minilateral efforts, and multilateral efforts, because to Yvette's point from earlier, there's a lot of nuance that needs to be dealt with, and depending on the context, the group of countries that are relevant to tackling a certain issue is going to change, and interests and objectives of different countries will vary on different issues. So I think what you'll see is a flexible constellation of different types of collaborative tech policy agreements, alliances. The digital liberalism issue, I think, will have a very large grouping of countries that are very interested in dealing with that. Other issues such as microelectronics, that might be a smaller group of core countries that want to deal with this. And then, of course, there's a lot of opportunity for minilateral approaches. So I think the developments that we've been seeing with the Quad is very interesting, right? Because here you have 4 democracies, but quite distinct in terms of their overall strategic objectives, but still coming together to start talking about issues of shared concern. Supply chains, I think, is going to be very much front and center. But these types of minilateral efforts are then, of course, a very good springboard for broader collaboration. So I would love to see the Quad, for example, engage with the European Union on supply chain issues and bring in countries like the UK, Israel, South Korea. So really, to sum up, what I think will ultimately happen is we won't have a distinct tech alliance to cover everything but it'll be a much more modular approach where you have a flexible structure where you can engage not just with other countries, but also with other organizations, existing ones such as the ITU, WTO, OECD, so that you can really adjust and shift according to the specific issues at hand.
So basically, you're agreeing with Anika, who also mentioned the ad hoc coalitions, the various types of countries being on certain issues in a certain coalition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll just jump on that comment. Yeah, I think Anika was spot on with that. And because to get back to your issue of competitiveness, right? In order to outrun, you need to be flexible. You need to be pragmatic. And I think certain countries will gravitate towards certain initiatives. So collaborative R&D investments in telecommunications, for example, is one way of running faster. And I think you'll see similar efforts, whether it's in biotechnology, quantum computing, and more structural efforts such as supply chain restructuring.
And maybe from a European perspective, one final question. What does the US expect from the EU in the coming years? Of course, strategic autonomy and tech sovereignty of digital sovereignty have been quite contested, especially in the transatlantic debate. Does the US hope for a really strong transatlantic partner, or does it want an ally that just follows the US on the certain policies? And what are your views on that?
My view is that it has to be a true partnership, right? I mean, if you look at the global technology landscape, the necessary resources and knowledge is very much diffused, and the United States or the EU, simply cannot go it alone and expect to be as successful as they could be. So there's much more incentive to have a true partnership approach to these issues, given the complexity of not just the technologies, but also all the inputs that go into technological innovation. Yes, there's a lot of things that you could do in terms of greater sovereignty, such as the EU is pursuing, and frankly, I think that's a good thing. But digital and technological sovereignty doesn't mean putting up walls and limiting engagement with others. It's in fact the opposite. I think it's almost a paradox, right? Where the European Union, for example, can be much stronger on a range of technology issues through partnership with the United States and other like-minded countries. So I think that's where the emphasis should be, because ultimately it's in the EU's best interest and in the United States' best interest that the transatlantic relationship is one of partnership and trust. There's always going to be some issues of disagreements, right? Such as on data privacy and data rights, for example. But the key thing is to have an open and frank dialogue on these issues, rather than putting up walls and saying, well, this is just too difficult to deal with, we'll try and do it ourselves. That ultimately isn't going to work, particularly when we're facing a very formidable economic competitor in China. And
talking about partnerships and digital economies, we are really happy to also have someone representing India, Rudra. Thank you for being here. What's, in your experience, especially in relation to the US, the EU, but also to China, everybody is looking at India. How does India experience this multilateral cooperation with the US? And how do you think it has affected the path India has taken in the last 4 years?
Thanks, Brigitte, and thanks to the Clingendael Institute, and it's nice to see everybody else. I think just a couple of points, right? So one is, it's clear that the Biden administration has this kind of biblical ambition when it comes to recovering global leadership, and multilateralism is at least rhetorically a big part of that story. But, and there's something Martijn said, which I found interesting. He said the Trump administration and those 4 years were an aberration. I'm not sure they were, right? In fact, I'm quite sure they weren't an aberration. Obviously, there's a kind of, it's chalk and cheese when it comes to Trump and Biden administration's approach to the globe. But I think one has to weigh the next couple of years, and I think that's what people in India will be watching for, is what does this biblical ambition actually mean when the rubber hits the road, right? And I say this for a couple of reasons. One, so think about multilateralism. What are we talking about? You're talking about the G20. India will preside the G20 in 2022. It'll host the summit in 2023. You're talking about the WTO. You're talking about WHO, UN reform, a more elaborated view of multilateralism, I hope, after this pandemic, is thinking more carefully about institutions like CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, where hopefully countries get together, put money into a truly multilateral instrument to prevent pandemics from breaking out in the future. You're talking about trade, and it'll be interesting to see what the new norms and rules for the Americans are when it comes to trade. But I'll just make 2 points. One is, this is also an administration that is committed to an audience within the United States that is broadly called the middle class, right? I don't think Jake Sullivan's piece on foreign policy for the middle class was just a campaign pitch written in February of last year, right? I think there's a serious commitment to that entire belt in the United States that has suffered at the hands of globalization, however you dice it. We're all globalists, we want globalization, but that's the reality and that's the fact. And I think this election brought that fact squarely in the center of democratic politics, right? So I'm interested to see, and I think people in India will be interested to see, is how does the United States and the Biden administration square the circle when it comes to multilateral commitments, right? And what will be an increasing kind of verve towards self-reliance, right? And that verve is going to exist. It's going to exist in Europe. It's going to exist in Australia. It's going to exist in the United States. The key question was that, can that self-reliance be built alongside globalized mechanisms, right? What does supply chain diversification actually mean? Can it actually be truly multilateral? So that's just my kind of a big point. And on some 2-3 smaller points, look, there's a great opportunity for India. As I said, it presides over the G20 in about a year. It'll host the summit. It's a member of the Security Council since January of this year. It has a true commitment to the WTO, and I think there the Biden administration position on the WTO is welcome, right? Hopefully the Americans will put those adjudicators back, put those judges back, and the WTO will start working the way it is, although now it has plurilateral arrangements within the larger system. I think the commitment to the WHO is critical, and there's one key commitment which I found interesting that's not been discussed so far, is to climate change, right? If you're talking about multilateralism, that's the big multilateral push that countries like India are going to be kind of all over when it comes to the COP26, co-hosted by UK and Italy. It is to see, and there the Biden administration is very clear that under John Kerry's leadership, they've got a climate change agenda. And therefore, a country like India is actually pretty good news, because despite the close structural relationship between the US and India, the minute the US pulled out of Paris, the Indian view was it doesn't matter. The commitment remained. India has made all those kind of key markers that it committed itself to the COP25. And my own sense is that that's where you're going to see some great cooperation, and hopefully a trilateral form of cooperation between the EU, India, and the United States. And I'll just end with one small point. When it comes to climate change, hopefully we'll move from the debate around carbon emissions to actual discovery of a new relationship in this troika, if you like, of technology exchanges, of patents, of climate change technology, of Indian companies now buying large industries in your country, in the Netherlands, right? So if you take Ola, for instance, which is the Indian version of Uber, it just invested in a battery manufacturing plant, in a green plant in the Netherlands. So hopefully that startup to startup, VC to VC, money to money kind of relationship will grow, where you're seeing a different kind of multilateralism. Last point, the good point is in a different aspect of multilateralism. I think with the Biden administration, their approach to Iran, some kind of a reworked version of the JCPOA will be welcome news to those in India, to bring Iran back into the tent, however difficult that's going to be, with the elections coming up in Iran, etc. So sorry for the long drawn answer, but I'll stop there.
No, perfect. And I think it's really valuable to link climate change, but also greening of the economy to the digital economy. Maybe just to close, I feel tempted to already react to many of the things you said, but do you think in the coming years, does India grow closer to the US and the EU, or will it focus more on just the Quad countries, or will it go its own way regarding to China and digitalization?
Just 3 quick points there. One, and I'll take you haven't asked it, but I'll take the question on tech alliances. It was interesting what Anika and Martijn said. I've got a very different view. I think Yvette said something. She said, tech should be depoliticized. Here's the short answer. It cannot be depoliticized. It's deeply technical. It's better we realize that from the outset, okay? Secondly, I'm interested to see what a tech alliance actually means. I have no idea, right? People talk about AI collaboration, ET adoption, quantum computing, 5G standards, but have I seen an example of that work out? The EU and India can't even agree to the treatment of data, right? You have an adequacy test in your country where the standard is so high, which is built primarily for the European Union. You have to get around the system to get an agreement with Japan. You're getting around the system to get an agreement with Korea, right? Getting a similar agreement with India is going to be next to impossible. So I think the first thing that when you think about the tech alliances, take a step back. What is the food? What is the ingredient that feeds technology? It's data. If you can't get your head around, if the EU and India and other like-minded countries can't get their head around how you start to treat data, then how do you start to share data? Then how do you start to access data in different jurisdictions? Then the rest of the fancy stuff on ET and AI adoption is going to remain parochial and theoretical. And I think that's an important point. There's a huge opportunity for the EU and India only if it gets beyond what is usually called functional issues. Just last in China is, look, after the Chinese incursions into Indian territory in the summer of 2020, structurally the relationship has changed. There's no doubt about it, right? There's a partial de-escalation that's taking place on the border. Hopefully that will continue. My own sense is once that happens, there will be a rethink in terms of the compact between India and China. And what that compact will look like will have as much to do with the bilateral relationship, with the trade deficit which favors China rather than India, with the role that the United States plays. And I think people will wait and see if what's happened in Alaska becomes the structural foundations of the Biden administration. And I hope not. I hope these guys can get beyond their rhetoric. And I hope at some level that there is a competitive but meaningful engagement between the two sides, right? And countries like India are looking to the EU. I can tell you is that from an Indian perspective, the EU ought to be the next big strategic partner of India, right? Only if it can get past its trade issues with the EU, if it can get past its technology issues. But when it comes to China, I think the Indians are looking at the European Union. There, I'll just end with this. It's that there's a structural problem, is the EU does not and cannot speak on China with a single voice, simply because of the way it is structured. So, and I hope that changes. Thanks.
Yes, I agree. I hope so too. Anika, Martijn, I wanted to give you a short 1 minute moment to react to the other panelists, just to keep the conversation going. Anika, starting with you, did you have any response to the other panelists?
I just wanted to reply to Rudra that I think he's absolutely right. High tech is definitely highly political, and that also applies for business. And I just would like to give you one example from Germany and from an industry that is not so, when it's not about chip industry or something, but it's more about materials that later being used to produce those chips. And for an industry that is reliant on many small and medium-sized industries, it's very critical to have resilient supply chains, and that will be in the very central, that will be a central topic for those industries that Germany is heavily dependent on. And one example maybe from a German hidden champion, which produces such materials in the field of material science. At the moment, they are faced with the problem of where they can still supply those materials in the future and where they can get their resources from. And without strong political support and reliable framework, they are at risk of being outbid in their business by Chinese competitors. So I think the point of creating new markets and having those rules that we all agree on is extremely important.
Right, Martijn?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to just respond quickly to Rudra's comment on what a technology alliance would look like. I think the working group that was just announced by the Quad, the technology working group, is a great example of how a more distinct technology alliance starts, right? So here you have 4 countries that are agreeing to set up a group to talk through specific problems that they face. Rare earths and critical minerals are a great example of a clearly identified problem, in this case that China just dominates the industry to such an extent that it can cause real problems if they decide not to export those materials anymore. So here you have 4 countries with a distinct need for alternate sources for the raw material, for processing, to be able to ensure that their industries, their companies have access to those materials for economic growth and defense needs. So that's just one example of how a more formalized tech alliance can come about. And there's a lot of issues that present itself as being the right way to address these things in a more alliance type of approach, right? Because so much of technology is entangled with each other. Anika mentioned supply chains. That's another example. If you want to start restructuring supply chains so you're not too heavily dependent on one geographic area, you have to do that in concert with other countries. There's no single country that can bring everything back to within its borders and be self-sufficient. There's really nothing that I can think of where a country would be capable of doing that. So again, partnerships and alliance types of approaches to these problems is really the only sensible way forward, I think. So the premise holds a lot of promise for going forward, and I'm thrilled to see India being an active participant in these discussions. And yeah, just to echo other people's points, the European Union has a critical role to play in this.
Yes. Just giving the floor to Yvette for 1 minute to let you respond as well, and maybe pose a first question to the speakers, if you have one, of course.
Thanks. Yeah, really interesting. I mean, the alliances, the flexibility, but also the granularity in terms of technology is key. I mean, we can have as many alliances and meetings and working groups as we want, but in the end, we will need to move forward with taking the right measures at the right level. No, I think, I mean, my call for depoliticizing, of course, I mean, everything is politics. We know that as diplomats, but the thing is that we need to look at this, from a surgical point of view, and that's I think my most important point still. So no, I see we are taking in all the different views and all the different possibilities that are put on the table, and I think it's good to hear that also from the Indian perspective, more impetus for a partnership with the EU on these issues would be very much welcome. And I think that deserves much more attention than it gets at this point. So that's basically what I have to add to this.
Perfect. Then now over to the questions of the participants. I see many people have already used the Q&A function. just one more time to repeat it. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A box. And we will just start with the first question from Mathilde Murray. Can we expect a collaboration between the EU, like-minded, and India and other Indo-Pacific actors in topics such as 5G network security? Would it lead to, on a larger scale, a clear division between techno-democracies and techno-autocracies? And I think for this question, it's also interesting that the Indo-Pacific is mentioned. How does this play a role in this whole debate? The EU will come with an own Indo-Pacific strategy in a few months. And also the Netherlands, Germany, France, and the UK already have one. Who shall I give the floor? Maybe we can start with Rudra and then work backwards. So Rudra, Martijn, and then Anika.
Yeah, thanks. So just 2-3 points. It's a good question. And I think, as I said, there's a lot of opportunity for cooperation on tech adoption between the EU and India. And 5G is actually a very good example. So if you take the Indian perspective at the moment, and I should say that it's an unsettled debate in India, what ultimate position it takes on 5G is yet to be seen once the auctioning actually starts. And that's an important point to keep in mind. But I think more and more where the Indian position seems to be going is to consider and embrace what's called an open architecture for 5G rather than a vertical architecture for 5G, right? So if you went with firms like Huawei, for instance, you would necessarily need to kind of design a vertical architecture for 5G. But I think what India is going for is an open stack approach. So essentially, think of 5G where you've got Korea, so you've got Samsung with a layer of technology over Nokia, Ericsson, and then some kind of a homemade Indian layer in the bottom, right? It's a stack, it's open, it's competitive, it's transparent. And that is if they were to follow through on this kind of an example, which my understanding is that that's exactly where the thinking is at the moment. You're not dependent on any one actor. You're more self-reliant because you're not dependent on any particular technology from a jurisdiction, right? And it's just a more transparent and effective way of doing a massive telecom build out, right? And by the way, the Americans will have a key role to play here as well. I mean, NTT, NEC, Japan, along with the US. So you're looking at about 6 or 7 very like-minded kind of actors coming together. It's a little bit more complicated to put together. It's a jigsaw puzzle that you got to make sure that it fits the right way. But I think that's a good example of kind of cooperation. But just one point, and here I'll, on the larger issue of the EU-Indian tech cooperation and alliances, if you put all your eggs in the tech alliance basket, you would get it scrambled, is my view. I think we're just too far away on the alliances. As I said, the working group's great on the Quad, but I'd like to see effectively what it does, apart from vaccine supply chains over the next 5 years. It's a good start, but I think what you're seeing is a lot more fragmentation in the tech area. You're going to see bilateralism, plurilateralism, and then you're going to see an inching closer to multilateralism. India says it doesn't want to be part of the DFFT at the G20, the Data Free Flow with Trust, right? That's a statement that the Indians have basically made. It's the largest open data market in the world. What are you going to do? You have to find a work around it, right? So I think what you will see is bilateral ways in which you can cooperate. And I think EU and India is a very good example. And over time, when those norms get settled and standardized, if they ever do, then you kind of move to plurilateralism and then ultimately to some kind of a multilateral alliance structures. Doing it top down, in my view, at least from from the perspective of tech data diplomacy, is unlikely to work.
And would you then also say, if I hear you correctly, that India would rather like to figure out what it's going to do, for example, with data, with a data regulation, but also big tech regulation first domestically before moving into such initiatives as the Data Free Flow with Trust from Japan? Of course, the RCEP.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the main reasons the Indian government, and I think rightly so, stayed away from DFFT is because it wanted to get its own house in order, as somebody said earlier about the US and the EU. And what does that mean? It means that India at the moment is debating a privacy bill. It's in what's called a joint parliamentary committee. Parliament will take a call on that bill. The minute that bill becomes a law, that is India's tech data policy in concrete, right? That's the architecture right there, right? And that then becomes the legal basis for international negotiations on data transfers, data access, ET adoption, quantum, and a whole range of other data-related issues.
Okay, clear. Martijn.
Yeah, I completely agree with Rudra on the promise of open interfaces for 5G. And I think this is a great example, right, of how a group of like-minded countries can work together and focus on technological innovation and shift the emphasis away from denying China, for example, certain technologies. But here you have a way where you can really boost your economic competitiveness by increasing vendor diversity. India, I think, is very well placed given its very strong software industry to be a major player in open interfaces. And there's a lot of potential for the European Union as well. And it's great to see that the four main operators in Europe have committed to Open RAN and open interfaces as the way they want to move forward. And so, to Rudra's point, there's just a tremendous opportunity for collaboration between the EU, Japan, South Korea, India, and the United States in crafting a true technological alternative that is safer, more cost-effective, more secure, and this then presents the ability to export that secure digital infrastructure to other parts of the world in a way that's sustainable and provides a true alternative to untrusted equipment from companies like Huawei and ZTE.
Anika, the floor is yours.
Thank you. As much as I like to agree, I have to temper the optimism maybe a little bit, because I think we should not overestimate our optimism about cooperation, and we also have to manage expectations. And in the past, in particular, it was sometimes, it seemed to be difficult to find common ground with India, and we should be ambitious. And of course, we should be ambitious, but we don't seize the opportunity now. It might be our last chance, and India's data protection is not compatible with that of the EU, and also the FTA that the EU and India are negotiating seems to be a dream that probably won't come true for a while. So as much as I'd like to agree, I still see that there are some difficulties to get this done.
Then moving on to a related question from Gary van Pinksteren. And this is more about the strength of the US versus the strength of China. China has, of course, entered the world stage, especially in the digital domain in the last 4 years, if not earlier. And the question is, how do you see the strength of the US versus China in technology if you compare now and 2016, when Trump was elected? Did the US lose ground or not? And I think, starting with Martijn for this question, I want to reform this question a little bit for Anika and Rudra, asking whether or not the US lost ground. Did it do something to the policies in your country? Did the EU, for example, grew closer to Japan and India just because the US retreated for a little while? Martijn.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'd say that the Trump administration had some tactical successes and some tactical setbacks. Particularly in how it engaged with like-minded countries. There were a lot of unforced errors in that regard, which I would count as a setback as far as its broader technological strength. Over the course of 4 years, it's kind of hard to determine like how much of a shift there was. I would say that the broader trend lines are worrisome for the United States when you look at the amount of R&D spending that China is investing in its high-tech industries. Obviously, it's very explicit about its strategy to be self-sufficient in a wide range of high-tech. And that's just not a concern for the United States. That should be a concern for all of the world's democracies. But the upside is that the new administration in the United States is committed to addressing that and is doing so in a strategic way. I think of course, it's still early days in the administration, but some of the initial signs are very important, right? Where you now have a technology directorate within the National Security Council. Jason Matheny, who's the new coordinator for technology and national security, reports to both the National Security Advisor, but also the Director of Office and Science and Technology Policy. Eric Lander, who's the nominee for that position, is a cabinet level official, and that's the first time that's been the case. The Department of Defense is doing a big review on tech matters. And then, of course, we'll wait to see. There's some key roles that still need to be filled. But all these initial signs show that America is moving towards a national technology strategy, which ultimately will be the best way to address the technological challenge that a rising China poses.
In the last 4 years, the US did move towards a more holistic technological strategy rather than specific little parts being executed by different actors, if I understand you correctly. So it basically did not lose much ground, it just revigorated. Martijn?
I'm sorry, the audio cut out. I missed your question.
That's okay. I was just asking whether in the last 4 years you revigorated to a more holistic tech approach, if I understood you correctly, rather than having the specific parts of the US government having specific technological strategies on its own, and now it's more holistic and integrated, in your opinion.
Yeah, it's moving in that direction. I think, there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes right now in terms of the executive order on supply chains, for example. There's still some organizational restructuring that's going on within the executive branch of the government. So I'd say, 2 years from now, we'll have a much better sense of how the U.S. government is establishing itself to take a more holistic approach. But again, all the initial indicators are such that we are moving in that direction. I think we'll see more effective and consequential policymaking from the administration as we move forward.
Rudra, being in the Indo-Pacific as one of the biggest economies, or the biggest economy there, how do you feel that the US has played its strengths in the last 4 years, and how does it relate to India?
Yeah. So here's the thing: in the last 4 years, I think India was very much an exception. So the way the Trump administration, the way the math seemed to work out is hit the allies the hardest, but be kind to the partners who can be equally transactional, right? If you look at the last 4 years, on the strategic side and the defense side, relations were swimming, right? There's a trend which is not broken when it comes to Indian import of defense sales from the United States. Trump and the Indian Prime Minister seem to have some kind of a chemistry, which was on display both in the United States as well as during his visit to India. Obviously, a lot changed. There was the multilateral break. There was a break in terms of international cooperation, but I think the relationship was not as one-sided or lopsided as perhaps it was between the EU and the United States for a variety of reasons. On the tech area in specific, what's again interesting about the Trump administration is that the only real functional national commission that I know of that looks to augment the US-India digital relationship was created under the Trump administration. It was not because of Trump, it was because of Congress. It was a National Commission on AI run by Bob Work and Eric Schmidt. You couldn't have two better people doing this, right? And essentially their exam question was simple: is how do you get these two countries, these outsized democracies, to think about common approaches to tech adoption, to AI, and to ETs more generally, right? And my sense is that that conversation will continue despite who the incumbent is in the White House, right? That's about private limited companies. It's about a very large ecosystem that lives outside of the executive, right? So I think that will thrive. But I think the view is, and the hope is very much that as the US-India partnership deepens when it comes to emerging tech, right? And you got to keep in mind is that for India, there's a structural issue. India has scale, it has data. The capital lies in Japan, the capital lies in the United States, and the capital lies in China, right? So as much as the US-India kind of tech roadmap will strengthen, it's possibly an unpopular view in India at the moment, but I would think that the China-India tech relationship, which thrives on startups. So it's not about exchange of technology when it comes to Sino-Indian relations. It's about Chinese startups setting up a shop in the suburbs of Bangalore and Hyderabad and Pune and other parts of India, right? Those investments were gated primarily because of the problems on the border with China. But my own sense is if those borders, and if China is honest about de-escalation on a land border with India, where it came into Indian territory, is that this part of the relationship could see some kind of some sort of a future. It'll be a different kind of a future, but there will be a future for that relationship itself. And I'll just come back to one point that Anika made, is 5G is a great example of where and how the EU can actually work with India. And don't put it in the BTIA or free trade box. Don't put it in the privacy and data debates that are going to happen, because those are going to happen. And here I'll take a nationalist position, is that perhaps the EU needs to get its head around Indian standards when it comes to data, right? If it wants to work with India, right? So there's a battle coming. Hopefully it'll be cooperative, but 5G doesn't, something like 5G or ET adoption doesn't necessarily need to get stuck into those older issues and older debates. Think ahead, think beyond that. You put it in the BTIA box, you'll be dead, right? The UK and India will possibly have a free trade agreement faster than the EU and India does. And you guys have been at it for a decade or over, right? Is take tech adoption as a bespoke issue. Don't put it in the collective EU Commission box. It won't go anywhere.
Anika, not representing only your institute, Germany, but also the European Union today. Would you like to react?
To your initial question, I think that the US appears to be still extremely strong, especially in the technical field. And it's also very strong competitor, especially for European companies. And compared to previous years, however, it seems as if everyone has lost ground and competition in general has become stronger, which is fine also for European or German companies as long as it's fair. And China has accelerated the pressure to innovate for everyone. And the EU, has been looking more at other countries. You just mentioned the Indo-Pacific guidelines, and that was definitely a consequence of the last 4 years under the Trump administration. But I think we can see that as a positive result, because the time was ripe to also turn the head and have a broader perspective.
Right, still 2 questions to go, so I think we have time for both of them. I first like to go to a question from Paul van Doorn, and that's the EU ambassador RTD. A menu of alliances to deal with a variety of issues looks attractive, but what about the enforceability of agreements reached in such alliances? Why do you exclude the WTO from the start? I just want to give maybe Yvette a second to react to the panel, maybe a little bit to this question, if you want, Yvette.
I didn't really get the gist of the question, but we don't exclude the WTO at all. I mean, there's a lot of, and that's, I think, also what Anika was saying, is the multilateral system fit for purpose? We need to look at that. We need to make sure that we upgrade it or nudge it differently in terms to be able to address this challenge. But that takes a long time and it takes a lot of effort. So, for me, it's parallel tracks. We can work in alliances. We can make sure that we're all on the same page. Data is mentioned. It's extremely important how we manage data, privacy, the value of data. Do we tax data? So these are all, I think, parallel tracks, and definitely WTO, WIPO, ITU. They're all organizations that we need to take as a reference and we need to work on, because that's, I mean, in the end, we all want to have a multilateral system, but it's not going to happen overnight. So let's put more horses in the race.
Yes, exactly. I agree, and I think of the new alliances could both be based on trust rather than strict guidelines or strict policies where everyone has to adhere to. Martijn, I see you nodding positively. Do you want to react to that?
Yeah, sure. I completely agree with you and Yvette on that point, right? At least the concept of these tech alliances isn't to replace existing institutions, it's to complement them. WTO, OECD, all these groupings exist for a reason, but there are also limitations in their current charter, and we also need additional groupings that can address some of the new challenges that we face with emerging technologies, and that ultimately is the premise. And the particular format that I've been arguing for, it's very much an informal organization. So any enforcement would just be an agreement between those governments to, proceed with a certain action, being it harmonizing export controls or doing a joint R&D effort. But critically, to Yvette's point, that grouping then works with existing organizations, because ultimately we need to bolster the WTO, we need to bolster 3GPP and ITU and other standard setting organizations to make sure that the spirit and intent of those entities persists, because that ultimately will create the strong multilateral structure that will bring us to the most beneficial future that we can shape for ourselves.
Yeah, maybe to broaden even the question just a little bit, Rudra, not only how do you see your answer to this question, but also how do you see the involvement of other actors than just governments in those coalitions or in those alliances, for example, businesses or think tankers, academia?
Yeah, so 2-3 points. I agree with Martin that these are exactly the bodies that need rework. But what I would say is take a step back and say is, what is it that each of these multilateral organizations are supposed to do when it comes to technology, right? So as Martin correctly said, some of them is about standards. WTO is about arbitration and difference, usually trade, right? So whether it's e-commerce, whether it is data, etc. APEX EBPR is about data transfers. The Budapest Convention is about data access. So I think, there was a time where me and our team at Carnegie India believed that you could create something like the D20, which would be the all-encompassing body by which you could deal with access, transfers, e-commerce, trade, etc. And then we actually realized we're barking up the wrong trees, right? It's not going to work. The view is, and I think is to be bespoke, and so is to work with each of these multilateral institutions for what they're worth at the moment, right? So if you think about digital taxation, it's a big issue, which is the kind of organization that is creating the rule map at the G20 is the OECD, right? So that's about digital taxation. If you think about data transfers, which is essentially something like a free trade agreement when it comes to data between jurisdictions, and you talked about who are the other actors, it's the APEX CBPR provides a good model. That's about private limited companies. It's about government. It's about harmonizing particular rules, standards, and certifications, right? Including privacy certifications. When it comes to access issues, an enlarged, rethought approach to the Budapest Convention could provide a multilateral solution to some of the critical issues in data access. What's the main problem between countries like India and the EU and the United States is that governments feel that they just can't access their own citizens or residents' data, which is held by private limited companies where their servers are sitting in Singapore or California. How do you get around that issue, right? You've had bilateral mechanisms like mutually legally, MLAT treaties, which don't work. They take about 12 months, by which time your bomb has gone off, by which time your criminal has already gotten off, right? And I think, as governments, we're going to have to think a lot more clearly about these issues, because if you don't, what you will see is the actual balkanization of the internet. If you don't solve this at the workable multilateral level, what you will see is an acceleration of data localization, right? That is the trade-off, right? There's no in-between path. You find a multilateral solution where governments feel that their law enforcement agencies can rightfully access data in a particular period of time, keeping privacy standards in mind. So you have to find a middle ground there. That has to be done multilaterally. Otherwise, if that energy starts to evaporate, you'll see countries like India, you'll see the EU become a lot more sovereign when it comes to its data approach, right? I mean, and I'll just end here. If the EU and the United States can't figure out their own privacy protocols and standards, which you can't at the moment, right? Because there's a difference clearly between the politics and the law, right? In the Schrems II kind of case, for instance, then how does the rest of the world come together when it comes to democratic alliances in technology?
And do you feel that that multilateral effort, especially in the field of data regulation, should that be put by the EU, the US, or do you see a role for India there?
No, and I think that the question itself, the premise of the question is problematic, right? Let's face it, the EU has a head start because of GDPR. It became the gold standard because it was 26, 27 countries that put it together. That gold standard is not going to work for the global South. You've already made exceptions when it comes to Northeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, right? You're going to have to make exceptions, but rather than think of the EU's approach to data as making exception after exception, I think at some level, the EU Commission is going to have to take a step back and say that maybe those standards need to be rethought, right? Because countries like India, by the way, are going to be, after that privacy bill becomes a law, it'll be a proud moment for this country, right? It's the federal law on privacy for the country, right? They're going to be screaming and shouting and saying is that, we've created this law, use this as a standard that you can export, which is where you need multilateral structures, which include the global South. You cannot do this as a US-EU exercise. This has to be the global South. It has to be where the data actually is, having these kind of arguments and having these discussions and coming to a genuine multilateral kind of broad solution. But I do maintain that in the next 5 years, you'll see a lot more bilateralism, which hopefully in time will then spill over into standardized norms in multilateralism. It's a complicated approach. I'm sorry, I don't have a clean answer, but don't make the mistake of taking a EU-US kind of position on these issues. The action's in the global South.
Yes, I agree, definitely. I mean, the amount of data India has and the way it's now basically putting its house in order to see whether countries want to exploit them or not, and to protect them against that. I think it's very valuable and also a lesson for the EU. Looking at the time, Anika, I'm also gonna give you a little bit of a part of the only question remaining in the chat. That is the UK. Of course, we in the EU have the GDPR. We now have the digital compass to talk about digitalization and high tech. Do you believe that cooperation on a tech alliance is still realistic given the animosity that now exists between the two powers? And also maybe some last remarks if you want.
You mean between the EU and the UK?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, hope dies last. So I think we should always be hopeful and I think there's definitely still a chance to come together in this field, but we will see in the future how this will play out.
Perfect. Then looking at the time, I think we have to close here. Yeah, thank you all for being here. It was a really inspiring debate. It went to all sides, I think, but still we found a line of putting our own houses in order and really engaging with each other rather than talking about each other. For now, I wanted to mention our fourth webinar. It will be on the 22nd of April about the semiconductor industry. We will send people in the Zoom meeting an invitation for that in a couple of weeks. And then I wish you all a really pleasant afternoon, and thank you all for being here. Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye. Have a nice week.